Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Stephanie Levitz, and I'm a senior reporter in the Globe and Mail's Parliament Hill Bureau here in Ottawa. 2 years ago, on this very day, Hamas terrorists invaded Israel and ignited a conflict that has reshaped the region and reverberated globally. And now we find ourselves at what may be an inflection point. US President Donald Trump's announcement last week of a ceasefire plan. It's raising urgent questions about whether a moment of genuine change is upon us, what that could look like, and what it might all mean. This morning, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has assembled a panel uniquely positioned to help us navigate these complexities. Over our time together today, we'll explore how these last 2 years have changed Israeli society, the Arab world, and broader geopolitical alliances. We'll talk about a byproduct of this war, a major resurgence of antisemitism here in Canada and around the world, and we'll try to assess the ceasefire proposal with clear eyes. Over these last 2 years, it's been challenging, to say the least, to have these kinds of conversations. But the fact that they're difficult topics makes them all the more important to tackle honestly and thoughtfully. And that's what I hope we'll be able to do today. I'm pleased now to introduce our panelists, and after their opening remarks, we'll get underway. At the close of our discussion, there will be time to take your questions as well. And now I'll turn to our distinguished panel. We'll begin with Casey Babb, who's a director of the Promised Land Project at MLI. Casey is a senior fellow with MLI, an international fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, an associate fellow with the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a research fellow with the Max and Tessie Zelikovitz Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University. He teaches courses on terrorism and international security at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs here in Ottawa. His academic research has been published globally, and he focuses on subjects related to terrorism, the future of warfare, cyber conflict, the role emerging technologies will have on the battlefield, and other contemporary issues. In addition, his views and expertise on antisemitism, Jewish life, and matters related to Israeli security have been featured in numerous publications. Thank you for being here, Casey. Our next panelist is Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, who is a research fellow with the ISGAP and an Egyptian-American intellectual specializing in modern intellectual history. His work focuses on Arab political thought, Arab intellectual history, and the globalization of anti-Semitism and revolutionary radicalism. Hussein previously served as assistant professor for Hebrew language and culture at the Defense Institute in Monterey, California. His writings have appeared in Commentary, Tablet, Mosaic, and the Athens Review of Books. Hussein is a sought-after commentator and speaker on issues of anti-Semitism and extremism in the Middle East. He joins us this morning from Washington, D.C. And finally, Einat Wilf. Dr. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli Parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey & Company. Einat joins us this morning from Tel Aviv. Thanks to you all. We'll now move to some opening remarks from each of you. Hussein, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you very much for having me on such a solemn day. October 7th was a threshold, a truly pivotal moment, not just in terms of regional politics in the Middle East, not just for the state of Israel, but also, I think, for a lot of people in different Western societies, given the consequences that we've been living in the past 2 years. Regionally, the attacks of October 7th completely altered the regional dynamics that were going then. Everybody remembers when October 7th took place in 2023, the Biden administration was already in advanced negotiations with Saudi Arabia in order to facilitate normalization with Israel. They were holding somewhat fruitless talks with the Iranians about their nuclear programs. The Abraham Accords were still leading the banner in terms of a hopeful and better future for the region. Just in the early hours of October 7th, 2023, all of these dynamics came to halt, and the region entered an era of uncertainty and security and basically regional warfare. What was in effect the first open Israeli-Iranian war that upended a lot of the plans that the region had, completely halted the Saudi normalization, not to mention that it woke Israelis up to a security reality that they have either forgotten about or that they thought that they moved from. As for Arab states who were hoping that the United States and Israeli power were going to check Iranian threats for them to continue their developing plans, talking about the Gulf states, specifically, I think also they woke up to a harsher reality that made them revert back to decades established patterns of Arab politics in terms of just survival instincts, selfishness, hedging against each other, balancing against each other, which made cooperation in the region much more difficult and returned the issue of Palestine into the center of Arab politics after a lot of people had hoped that it had receded. Most ominously, among the Arab population, after the decade of the upheaval of the Arab Spring, the various transformations that went into the region, we've seen how the sentiments, the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, that basically are packed into the Palestinian cause, re-emerge back, kind of a return of the repressed in a lot of Arab cities, a lot of Arab countries. But I think the most upsetting and disturbing development is the explosion of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Western cities across Europe and across North America. Unbelievable level of hatred and venom towards Israel and the Jewish people at large suddenly erupted out of, ironically, our most privileged, our most prestigious, our most esteemed institutions, defended by our mainstream and legacy media, and often our political establishment, and eventually leading to, I would say, political changes in how the liberal political establishment or the Western political establishment have largely viewed the state of Israel and viewed its commitments to the post-war consensus against anti-Semitism. All of this have happened in a relatively short period of time that I think left a lot of us disoriented.
Thank you, Hussein. I'm going to hold you there because we're going to unpack so many of those topics over our time together. And I'm going to go to you, Dr. Wilf, for just some opening thoughts to set the stage for today's discussion. Oh, I believe you're muted. Sorry.
So a few words first about the current moment. There's a joke that says that second marriages are the triumph of hope over experience. And I think Israelis find themselves at this moment where we very much want to hope. We want to hope that this is a moment where things could be transformed. But we are facing the knowledge of bitter experience. And indeed, what the invasion and massacre of October 7th forced us to do is to reckon with the fact that we have enemies, and especially one enemy that is devoted to a total ideology that leaves no room to maneuver, no room to negotiate. After many years in which Israelis have believed that ultimately we are in a negotiating position with an enemy that ultimately wants what we want, self-determination, dignity and sovereignty in their own state, and made numerous attempts to reach various agreements and even non-agreements based on that premise, we had to contend with the fact that we're facing an enemy whose ideology is total. I've come to call this ideology Palestinianism, which is essentially the singular obsession with the non-existence of a Jewish state. It is an ideology that tragically unites the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and many of their supporters and collaborators around the world, around the singular vision that their noble goal is to ensure that there is no Jewish state anywhere to be found, no sovereign Jews anywhere in their ancestral homeland. And this has worked very closely with the rise, what people call the rise of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, is something that I find almost doesn't even begin to touch how dangerous this moment is. What we are facing is really what is the core, the historical core of the Western and sometimes Islamic attitudes towards the Jews, which is that salvation, whether religious or secular, waits on the other side of ridding the world of the collective Jew. That a clean world, a better world, a world of human rights awaits us on the other side of that. And essentially, Palestine and Palestinianism have become the abstract marker of how we get to that world. And this is how you see this bizarre support of queers for Palestine and feminists for Palestine, which might seem odd on the surface. But if you understand the sinister logic beneath, it's perfectly clear that they all believe that if Palestinianism, if Palestine as the mark of Jewish erasure were to happen, then the world would be a better place.
Thank you for that, Einat. And Casey, let's turn to you for some opening reflections, in the Canadian context.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie.
And how you see, the context of the conversation we're having.
Yeah, I mean, Einat set my thinking up perfectly, because she mentioned the reckoning that we're now going through, and she used the term enemies. And what's become clear to me, and I think to many other people since October 7th, is that I think many of us, we were under the impression that we understood the world. Many of us have spent time working in national security and intelligence, or the academic community studying global conflict, or looking specifically at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whatever. We've had these experiences and this insight that 2 years ago, I think many of us felt pretty confident in our abilities to see clearly, to anticipate, and to understand the environment around us. And what October 7th has been to me has been a wake-up call. It has revealed many things. It has revealed a rot in our society, which is particularly acute in the Canadian context. It is not my thinking that October 7th caused these things, but rather led to a cascading sort of effects of a fallout, if you will, where these things became clearer to us, which were perhaps not as clear prior to October 7th. And, Einat mentions Israel's enemies. Well, not all, but most of Israel's enemies are outside of Israel. Some of them are very close to Israel, and many of them border Israel, but they're outside Israel. In Canada, over the last 2 years, it has become clear to people that our enemies, our being Canada, the West, the United States, allied countries, our enemies are here already, and they are within. They are within the gates. And we see this at our universities. We see this at NGOs. We see this at unions, all levels of government. Their strategies and their insidious sort of the creep of their ideologies has really permeated in a way that I don't think many of us saw coming or were appreciative of how serious it was. And so the last 2 years have been really illuminating, painful, but illuminating. And so I think it's very important that we're here today to talk about these things. And I'm delighted that Hussein is here in DC, and I'm in Canada, and Einat is in Israel, because there are a lot of things going on in these countries right now that we need to talk about. And Stephanie, I'm sure you have some questions that we'll get into. So I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you to all three of you. And you've all brought up so many themes that I'm really hoping to unpack in our time together. But I want to go back to October the 7th, 2023. And, for our audience and for ourselves, if you can each, take a moment, and maybe we'll go in reverse. Einat, we'll start with you, about when you sort of became aware of the attack, what had happened. what was your understanding of what that moment was, and how have the last 2 years and everything that's followed since maybe changed your understanding of what that moment was in some way?
So my story is very typical of many Israelis that day. It was a school vacation. We just came back from a family vacation, woke up Saturday morning to the sirens and the rockets. Like most Israelis, assumed that it was some form, bizarrely, of business as usual. There will be rockets. It will be annoying. We'll go into the safe room. We went into the safe room with my family, and things will be over in a few minutes. But as we kind of logged into the various social media, and it slowly dawned on me, again, all Israelis tell the same story of the slow dawning that this was different. Something else was going on. We began to, like, people, as I'm sure you know, Israel, even though we're 10 million people, still very much a family interwoven societies. People had friends, family, WhatsApps, messages, the understanding that this is an invasion, a massacre, something of a completely different scale, something that we've never experienced. So it took several hours for this kind of realization to dawn that this was something of a completely different nature and scale. And by the end of that day, it was clear that there was not such a single day, certainly not for Israel, that this was more than the opening attack of the Yom Kippur War, and that this was really the bloodiest, most brutal and violent day against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. In many ways, I feel 2 years today that I still don't know what happened, in the sense that there were thousands of simultaneous events happening at the same time. Uh, we all of us try to bear witness every day, but today especially. There are so many stories, the stories of those who were killed, the stories of those who fought, the stories of those who escaped, the stories of those who were abducted, those who survived, those who didn't. They are thousands and thousands and thousands of individual stories, harrowing stories, stories of triumph. And we are not, it's so clear to me that we're going to spend the next years and decades just learning what happened on that day. So this is my feeling on this day, that I actually don't even yet know what happened, and that it will take us years and decades to actually know what happened.
Hussein, what's your perspective here?
I can't claim, of course, that I had an experience remotely similar to Einat. She's Israeli. She was in Israel. I was here, safe home at DC. But I actually happened to wake up in the middle of the night to drink some water at 2 a.m. Just by pure coincidence. And people who are like us or like me, addicted to the internet, can't help but check notifications. So I check the notifications, and then I see one of the videos of the Hamas fighters. I think one of the early ones when they were parading Shani Look into Gaza. And I remember being in complete and utter shock about what I was seeing. I enter social media, I start checking, and then I see all the videos, especially on X, just being listed one after the other. And you see one video, you think this must be a single terrorist attack, maybe a cell of 10 Hamas fighters infiltrated and did this. And then you see another one, okay, maybe it's a larger group, and then maybe a larger group. And then at one point, you start realizing that this is something that you actually don't know what's going on. This is something that we've never seen before. And in that moment, as Casey said, a lot of the certainties and the understandings that you thought that you had about that part of the world completely come down crashing. I was involved, for me in particular, I've been involved for quite some time in Arab-Israeli normalization efforts by the virtue of being Arab myself. And it was really an era or basically since the Abraham Accords up to that moment, there was a drive of hope that things are changing, things are difficult, there's still a lot of rough edges, negotiations are extremely complex, everybody wants something different, but there was that sense of things are moving forward. But then just in one moment, everything came crashing, and you start realizing that probably the next year or how many years are going to be extremely difficult. You just understand that war, it was inevitable at that point. And since then, that's exactly what we've been dealing with.
And Casey, let's bring you in here. Just, how you've seen, how you understood that day in the moment and 2 years on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've only really just been thinking the last couple of days about where I was. I've asked so many people this. I've asked Einat, I've asked other people at Canada's, Israel's ambassador to Canada, where were you on October 7th? How did you find out? What were you doing? I've never thought about myself, where I was and what I was doing until recently. And I cannot remember for some reason, which I find very strange. I was a young boy, really, when 9/11 happened. I know exactly where I was when 9/11 happened. I remember conversations with my father on that day. I remember, a completely different event when the United States eliminated Osama bin Laden. I know exactly where I was when I found that out and how I reacted. On October 7th, it's almost as though it was too much. It was too overwhelming that there's some part of me that has compartmentalized it or suppressed it. I remember looking at a family member of mine and saying, I think this is really bad. Something very bad is going on. But aside from that, those first few days, I don't really recall too much. So I think it's partly because of how traumatic it really was. I mean, these are images that human beings are not supposed to see these things. These are not supposed to happen. And then I think there was another part of it where, Stephanie, immediately after October 7th, quite literally on October 8th, there were celebrations in the street here in Ottawa and across other major cities throughout the world. And I think many of us, and I imagine Einat and Hussein, to a certain extent, will understand what I'm saying here, almost pivoted very quickly from the shock and trauma of what's going on to mobilizing to address the fallout of October 7th. It was almost as though on October 8th, some part of me said, we got to get to work. We have to, this is outrageous. We have to do media. We have to start writing about these things. We have to start talking to members of the community. We have to talk with law enforcement. We have to talk with the government. So it's almost as though it was the flurry, the rush of being busy, where I don't really recall those days. But, shortly thereafter, Stephanie, I remember doing a talk radio interview in Chicago, of all places. And I remember the host, Joan Esposito, said, how long when is this going to end? When is this going to wrap up? What's going to happen? And at that time I said, this is going to take years. And she was flabbergasted that I said years. And so I think even then, as others have noted, we realized the significance that this was different and this was going to take a long time and this was going to be really painful and grueling. And of course, that's what it's been.
Let's talk about some of that fallout if we can. And Hussein and Einat, I'd love to hear from you about from where you sit and from the work you do. What do you see as the biggest misconceptions in the Western world about how Israelis are thinking about the last 2 years and how the Arab world is thinking in the last 2 years? And I'll use a bit of an analogy. I was speaking with an Israeli friend and she was referencing all of the grandmothers who were like knitting beanies for the IDF. And it's like Israelis don't need the beanies. Like there is a disconnect between how this conflict is being felt, understood, responded to, both in the Arab diaspora and in, let's say, the Jewish diaspora versus the reality on the ground in those two places. And I wonder if you could unpack that a bit for our audience. I don't know which of you wants to jump in first, but either of you can go ahead there.
Sure, I can go ahead first. Well, I think it's really all nothing but a lot of misunderstandings. It also depends on what do you mean by Western audience. I mean, what segment of the population we talk about. If we're talking about the young people who've been protesting for pro-Palestine, I think all of the understanding of the conflict is pretty much one big distortion and misunderstanding. Basically, what we have seen, sadly, and we just talked about this, is that you had all of this explosion in the support for Hamas literally as the massacre was going on. People forget that actually the events had not ended when the first demonstrations on Western cities came out with the flags of the Palestinians and the campaigns online for supporting Hamas, which was really just at this point, it's not really a support; it's a symbolic participation in the massacre itself. It was still actually ongoing. And then you have this massive number of young people who've been drawn to this cause because they basically think of Hamas as Django Unchained, the rich of the earth coming back to decolonize and take what's there. So their entire understanding of the conflict is just these left-wing ideological cliches and memes that have been superimposed on a conflict halfway across the planet in languages that they speak none of, yet they feel extremely certain that they actually understand exactly what's going on. They know the answer. They know who's the villain here. So that's a large segment that is now we've been exposed to as to be extremely problematic, and we don't know how we're going to deal with this problem. I mean, 2 years later, we still don't know what exactly to do with young people, whether the ones who are getting their education from TikTok or the ones who are getting their occupation from now an overwhelmingly left-wing professoriate and faculty. Now, if you're talking about an actual more liberal segments of Western society, I think also they're misunderstanding. They have fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the conflict, about what the Palestinians actually want, about what is the Palestinian cause. That is, they view the conflict as this national, still in the prism of the Palestinians want a national home. They need a country. All what we need to do is just to go back to some version of Oslo, in which the Palestinians will get a state, and then the problem will be solved. This is also a fundamental misunderstanding about Palestinian society, what happened since Oslo, and what actually the Palestinian cause itself failed to become, and what it is. The amount of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that embedded, that really underlies the Palestinian cause itself, that often doesn't translate to anything but to destroy Israel. The Palestinian social failure, in which basically there is no institutional building force in society that can actually oversee stabilization of that society, let alone overseeing the establishment of a state or managing a state. Now, the last point here, I would say that one of the biggest misunderstandings about this conflict is that this is a binational conflict to begin with. Well, it's not. October 7th was not about the Palestinians. It was much more about Iran than it was about the Palestinians. This was actually Iran's war from the beginning. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict have always been an index of regional rivalry, competitions of countries like Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Jordan, Egypt, other Arab states, each of them trying to extract resources, manage rivalries through that conflict. Had this been about the Palestinians, this would have ended already back in the 1950s. The problem exactly is that this has never been, sadly, about the Palestinians. And even we see this now, even with the ceasefire talks, the amount of states involved. I mean, the White House is bragging about how many states involved. That's exactly the problem. Why are so many states involved in such a small conflict that should be managed in much more pragmatic and technical way?
I want to come back to that when we get to the ceasefire, because I'm really taken by something I read of yours where you talk about this really as a structural conflict, not as a binational. But I'll go to you, Einat, now, just for the converse there. From the Israeli perspective, when you look at how the West has responded, what are you seeing and going, well, that's not how we see things here in Israel. You don't get this.
So I agree with everything Hussein said. I would say that the only thing that, I don't know if it's a misunderstanding, but it is a kind of deep disappointment at, I don't know if it's the willful blindness of so many Western countries, leaders, the fact that they don't understand that how they've come to enjoy their peace, they are depriving us of that. I'll share a few months ago, I was in Paris at a conference to discuss, how to bring peace and all that. And like Hussein said, they were all stuck in the 90s. We should just get back to the negotiating table, revive the two-state solution. And I remember really having that sense of being stuck in the 90s. And at one point, the European moderator asked me, how can the Europeans help? And my experience often is that when Europeans ask that questions, it's always with this smug notion of how can we enlightened Europeans help you savages solve your endless conflicts? And I told her, yeah, it would really be nice if you just remembered how the EU became the EU and how you could begin to think of yourselves as peace loving Europeans. And it wasn't because you sat to a negotiating table and you were all enlightened. It happened because there were some ruthless leaders of the Allied forces that understood that World War II, unlike World War I, will not end with a wishy washy armistice. It will end with the defeated knowing that they were defeated, paying in land, displacement, and reparations so that it is etched into their very national identity that they took a wrong path and that it cost them and they lost. And I told her, all I want is for us to have that. And I said, the ideology of Palestinianism, which, as Hussein correctly said, has drawn into it the support over the centuries of every anti Semitic and anti Zionist power in history, from the Nazis to the Pan Arabists to the Soviets to the Iranians, now Turkey and Qatar. And that ideology has to die so that the people of the region might finally live and enjoy what Europe is having. So for me, the biggest misunderstanding, I think what many Israelis feel is, how could the leaders of a continent of the West that once understood that certain ideologies have to be defeated and they need to know that they were defeated, what happened that they became so wishy-washy?
And Casey, let's bring it home to Canada for a second, and just your assessment. I mean, over the course of this conflict, we've seen a lot of domestic political upheaval here in Canada, right? We've gone through a national election, the end of Justin Trudeau, and simultaneously or in parallel, I don't know. I don't want to link the two things by any stretch. We have had this stunning rise of anti-Semitism in Canada that, statistics really testing the bounds of Canadian society, creating a lot of divisions. I'm packing a lot of things into two things, but I wonder about your thoughts about how the Canadian government and the Canadian society as a whole have responded here over the last couple of years.
The way that Canada, and I'll just talk Canada broadly, government, NGOs, academic institutions, the media. Sorry, Stephanie, but there's a lot of spheres here that I'm talking about at once. The response hasn't just been bad or disappointing. The response collectively has been a profound betrayal, and it has also been a seemingly exercise in self-harm. And so what I mean by that is, what I consider to be a normal person on October 8th, the path is clear on what happened and what should be said and what should be done. I hate when people say, well, it's complicated. A next door neighbor of mine, God love him, smart guy, in October or November 2023, I said, "Oh, you're going to talk to your family about this? What do you like? What are they? They're probably curious." He said, "I just tell them it's complicated." It's not that complicated. And so what we've seen are all of these spheres collectively, as a country, as a society, as a people, fail in meeting the moment and appropriately addressing what we're seeing. And it's almost as though, if I step back and think about it, I mean, it's laziness, it's incompetence, it's all of these things that we know about, but it is something else. And it feels as though many people perceive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more broadly, as a Jewish Arab or Jewish Islamic conflict, as something that is part of nature, in the same way that there is the wind and the sky and the trees. There is a forever animosity, and a war, both hot and cold and ideological, between Jews and Muslims. And that is not something for us to deal with. That's not our problem. And if we were to really deal with it appropriately and speak about it appropriately, we know what side we would have to come out on. And so we would rather not do that. Because if we talk critically about a certain group of people or groups of people, we'll be labeled something. And Canadians are most afraid of being labeled an ism or a phobic of something. That is what people around me and who I interact with appear to be most afraid of. They're not afraid of losing the country. They're not afraid of the DNA of the country changing. They're not afraid of the social fabric of the country changing, of social division. They are afraid of offending. And our deep and never-ending fear of offending has really limited our ability to come out clearly in response to what has happened since October 7th. And so we would rather see everything we've built and everything we believe in slowly erode than be the person who comes out and says something. And so, I'll say this, Stephanie, people sometimes, if I speak, if I do an event here or there, they'll come up to me after and they'll say, God, it's so great that you did that. It's so brave. And I go, what? I don't really care for that, because to me, I'm saying the most basic stuff that everybody should be saying. Why is it brave for me to be coming out and saying the things that our governments should be saying, that the presidents of the universities should be saying, that the CEOs of the media companies should be saying? So there has been a complete sort of abandonment of what we should be doing. And into that void has come, as I spoke about in my brief opening remarks, the enemies within have stepped into that void. And right now it feels like we're at we've crossed the Rubicon, so to speak. And now we need to figure out, well, we've crossed it. Now what do we do?
There's so much there. I can think of so many questions to ask next, and I think about exactly what you're saying, Casey, about people being afraid to sort of speak up, and the converse. There have been tens of thousands of lives lost in this conflict, and in many cases, Palestinian women and children who've been killed, and people look at those photographs, rightfully so, and feel a lot of humanity. And people also, I think, look at some of the victims of the attack on October 7th and hold them and look at the humanity and are asking, where is the humanity in all of this? What have we lost that we can't have these conversations? And perhaps that's maybe an awkward segue, but a segue nonetheless. Let's talk about where we are today. Let's talk about, how did we get to this Trump ceasefire plan? And, there are lots of fits and starts about, we're going to end it this way. There have been pauses in the conflict. There have been some hostages returned over time. And maybe I'll just open it up to the three of you, being mindful we have about 20 minutes left in our conversation, for your assessment of how we got to this moment. Why is it now that Trump has decided to engage, put this plan on the table, the sides are coming to it? And what your understanding is, if you had to take those 20 points that he's put on the table, is any of it realistic, or are we back? And Hussein, maybe this is a great place to start with you, and this notion of a structural conflict and what this ceasefire plan represents in the context of this being a conflict that's much bigger than the sum of its on surface two parts. We'll start with that.
Well, if the goal is to basically achieve a ceasefire at any cost, I think, yes, of course, that's an achievable goal if you're flexible about the costs that you would incur and you would impose on Israel. I think, yeah, it's possible to achieve a ceasefire. If it's to achieve a permanent settlement of the issue, if Gaza, given the way that this plan came up, and given a lot of many of its details and also the actors involved, I think that's a much more skeptical about that. First of all, how we got here. I think first of all, there is an exhaustion in a lot of people about the war. This has been going on for quite some time. We've seen this in Western countries specifically. I think large segments of the population, even forget the ones who are anti-Israel. Actually, the ones who are anti-Israel, ironically, are the ones who don't want the war to end. A lot of them, which is weird because if you think there is a genocide, you should be happy that the genocide is going to end. But that doesn't seem to be the case. But otherwise, I think a lot of people are exhausted by this war. And also remember that this war was not just a small war. This was one of the largest, probably the largest media and ideological circus in modern times. You had operations by countries, Iran, Russia, Qatar, to influence people. We've seen what happened. Of course, this is also happening within already a chaotic informational environment of social media. So I think that energy was there. For President Trump, let's remember what's been happening for the past maybe 7 months or so in his MAGA base. You started seeing the formation of this alarmingly growing anti-Semitic bloc, an anti-Israel bloc that nobody actually saw coming. I would be the first to admit I did not see it coming myself. And by the end of the day, this is the base of President Trump, and President Trump has to balance himself in this base. Now, the Israeli attack on Qatar, I think, had a decisive role to play. I think it completely disrupted Qatar's plan and just its own balancing act of being completely safe from all harm while controlling all of these threads and manipulating all of these actors and being a direct, really party of the Gaza conflict. I think all of these elements just converge together to bring President Trump to the point in which he's ready to impose such a ceasefire. As I said, I don't know if what he sets out to achieve will be achievable. There are big challenges, I think, that can't be achieved. For example, disarming Hamas. Anybody who knows anything about Islamist movements, especially armed Islamist movements, especially one with the record of Hamas, know that them abandoning armed struggle and completely leaving power in Gaza voluntarily is almost impossible to do. Second, to bring so many actors, you have Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Jordan, other Arab states. Supposedly, these countries are going to have a board of technocrats that they will cooperate together to actually manage post-war Gaza. I think it's a funny idea. These countries do not know how to work together. All of them are rivals that have been using the conflict, and that's exactly my point about the structural conflict, in order to actually extract resources against each other. That is, the conflict is Qatar balancing against Egypt, balancing against Turkey, balancing against the Saudis, balancing against the Iranians, Iranians using it to attack everyone else. Qatar is using it to have regional and global influence. Now, bringing all of them together, saying that they are going to help us reach a resolution, I think is a very naive proposition. And I think it's most likely to fail. Again, that doesn't mean that there won't be a ceasefire for some time. But basically, just the plan as it is right now, I do not foresee anyone putting a single dollar in Gaza, knowing that a year from now, it can also be redestroyed.
Hey, now we'll pivot to you, like from your perspective, from what is going on in Israeli domestic politics, the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump. It seems sometimes that Netanyahu says one thing in Hebrew to an Israeli audience. He says a different thing in the White House, perhaps. There's a tension there. Where do you think this comes from? Why is Netanyahu now seeming to want to come to the table?
First of all, we need to understand what the plan is. Because what happened is this: the American president presented a plan that the Israeli prime minister could agree to. First of all, because much of it is open to interpretation. So obviously the Israeli prime minister presented the Israeli interpretation of the plan. And the other thing is that it included the one thing that we still need to see if it's going to happen, the one thing that was not available previously, which is the release of all the hostages as a first step. I mean, by now we've normalized it, but it's insane that we've accepted as normal that the Gazans could kidnap so many people and then they are legitimate negotiators to ransom them. And that they can ransom them not just in exchange for butchers in Israeli jail, they can ransom them for political goals, which is something that's unprecedented. So the one thing that is not open to interpretation is the release of all hostages in the beginning. It remains to be seen if that can happen, because it's one thing when you can see actually quite a bit of unity in Israel around this. If this can happen, then let's take this deal. Now, what's important is this. The American president issued an ultimatum based on this plan. Hamas said yes to something completely different. The American president decided that Hamas said yes to his plan, which they didn't. And then he basically demanded that Israel pretend also that Hamas said yes to his plan and act accordingly. In the years when I worked with Shimon Peres, he had this phrase that in lovemaking and peacemaking, it's good to keep your eyes a bit closed. Now, I'm making no comment on lovemaking. I can definitely attest to the fact that in peacemaking, it has been an absolute disaster. I've developed, therefore, the concept of constructive specificity. There was this concept of constructive ambiguity, especially during the Oslo years. Let's keep everything ambiguous. The most important thing is to get the sides to the table. And this is what we're seeing now, this effort to have ambiguity as long as everyone is in the table. But there is pretty much nothing in the plan where the sides can agree on. The plan does nothing to address the root causes of the conflict, which would have been incredibly easy if people decided to be specific. Everywhere where it says coexistence or peace or de-radicalization or path to Palestinian statehood, all they had to say is, we make it clear that no one in Gaza is a Palestine refugee, certainly no one in the West Bank, no citizen of Jordan. There's no such thing as a settlement project inside Israel called the right of return. And any rebuilding of Gaza will proceed after this happens. This is the surefire way to do de-radicalization and coexistence. But no one wants to say anything specific, because if you're going to say anything specific, you're going to find out that you're not agreeing about anything. So my understanding is that the American president basically wants to go back to the Abraham Accords. It's his crowning diplomatic achievement. He wants to expand it. There's also Nobel Prize discussions. And for that, he needs 2 years of quiet on the Palestinian front. It has to be the kind of quiet where everyone could be arguing about bureaucratically how to build this body and how to disarm. But my interpretation of what he's doing is that he just wants the whole Palestinian issue to go kind of just, for 2 years, please don't bother me too much so that I can proceed with the Abraham Accords. My recommendation, at least within Israel, is just like it didn't work last time. It's great if we can expand the Abraham Accords. We should definitely take it if that happens. But we should not take our eyes off the ball of ensuring that Palestinianism as an ideology is pushed to the margins. And that means to get to a broad understanding that no one is a Palestine refugee. There's no right of return. UNRWA is the fueling station, needs to be closed down. Basically, we need to begin a long-term process of depriving Palestinianism of any support, because otherwise it's an ideology that will continue to bring forth destruction.
I want to ask there just briefly, what do you mean by there's no right of return? Like, in your view, how do you see then
it's not
Palestinians where they live now?
Let's start with it. There's no such thing in international law for a group of people who've never been citizens of a country established in the wake of a disappearing empire to settle in that country against its sovereign will. There's just no such right. The fact that Palestinians believe that there's such right, that they've constructed their entire identity, still doesn't make it so. So there is no right for a people to settle inside Israel against Israeli sovereign will. They've never been citizens of Israel. The general way that it worked, when empires collapsed, new nations were established, new borders created, tens of millions of people fleeing across that border. That was it. The Arabs, the Palestine Arabs, are the only people that they were able, through violence and hijacking and blackmail, to create a kind of loop and world in which they believe that they possess that right. And they need to understand, 75 years too late, that there is no such right and that they can build their future where they are, but they need to stop imagining a future that is built on the ruins of Israel.
Casey, let me bring you in here for your assessment of the 20-point plan and the role Trump, the Arab world. But again, we'll go back to the West. I mean, where are the Western leaders in all of this? And what does this deal mean more broadly? What could it mean for the more broadly sort of security dynamic we have?
Well, Einat and Hussein really covered a lot of what I have to say about this. The thing that I find most interesting and disappointing and demoralizing is that, and Einat has written about this for years and years and years, and I would encourage everybody to go read what she's said about these things. Trump puts forward this peace plan, which to me, I actually went and read that there's actually, just so folks are aware, there's actually a document, a very nice, polished, glossy document that you can go on the internet and read, and it's very comprehensive, and it's quite impressive, really. Trump comes out with this peace plan. Hamas goes, no, thank you. Our leaders go, right on. Hamas is in, they said yes. And I'm going, no, Hamas literally just said no to the plan. And our leaders are high-fiving each other like we're moving this thing in the right direction. Again, time and time again, decade after decade, the Palestinians say something. And Hamas are Palestinians, by the way. People need to stop acting like there's some alien force that was parachuted into the Palestinian territories. They don't represent the Palestinians. This is complete baloney. Hamas right now is speaking for the Palestinian people. We don't demand anything of them in the way that we demand of other communities, of other groups of people around the world, of people within our own countries. Trump puts forward this plan, which, as others have noted, it's about being a ruthless leader. It's about being ruthlessly pragmatic. It's about throwing a grenade into a room that hasn't changed in 100 years and closing the door and hoping something changes. It's about leadership. It's about legacy. It's about his own self-interest. I don't care about any of that stuff. I care if he actually is legitimately able to move the needle here. And so he's put forward a plan. And, that old saying, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. This is quite an opportunity here. But what they need, evidently, are world leaders to push that on them and say, this is the only way. And no one's doing that. And so because of that, generally speaking, this is destined to fail, as the Olmer plan didn't work, as 1948 didn't work, as every other offer has been made didn't work. So right now I'm trying to look at it as, if we can get the hostages out, if the hostages can get out of there, then deal with everything else. But that's sort of how I'm looking at the offer, because Hamas has said no, the Palestinians have said no, we're good, thank you. But they have acknowledged that there could be some willingness to let go of the remaining hostages. So that's where we are right now. But Stephanie, it's really revealed again so much. I mean, about Canadians, about Western leaders, about our inability to really look in the mirror and challenge our beliefs, not about the world, but about ourselves, about what we believe in. And you're seeing that people are really not, again, meeting the moment, and they are not able to think pragmatically, think realistically about these things. And that's why you have sort of this forever conflict, because nobody can get real about it.
We just have about 6 minutes left for our discussion before we move for some questions. So what I want to stay with you, Casey, for a second, but I'll ask all of you maybe to reflect on this a little bit. This note, like, as we talked about off the top, the attack of October 7th really, to use an expression you just used, tossed a grenade into a room. Like, it really destroyed so many assumptions. And I know that there's a lot of conversations that are happening about, obviously that genie will never go back in the bottle, but the divisions it has exposed, the anti-Semitism, one of you alluded to it before, there was so much work done for a long time, I think, just on interfaith collaboration, right? Like positive and meaningful spiritual relationships between Jews and Muslims and Christians, those have been destroyed, right? How do we is there room to heal these divisions? Can we be at all optimistic or hopeful that the anti-Semitism that's been unleashed and all of these divisive forces in I'll go with Canadian society, Casey, and the potential security threats they might lead to, can we solve that? And what does it take to solve that?
Well, this is a very challenging question. I mean, I wish I had the answers. I'd probably be making more than $7,000 a social media post if I had all the answers. No, I'm kidding. I don't get paid. $7,000. But look, one thing I will disagree with, Stephanie, is that you mentioned that there's been decades of effort has gone into interfaith dialogue and allyship and building relationships between different religious communities. It's true that has happened. Millions of dollars have been spent, thousands of hours, so much human capital, tons of effort. But October 7th didn't destroy those things simply because nothing had ever come out of those things, which is why you're not seeing in Canada or the US or the Netherlands or Australia or any other country around the world, you're not seeing thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Muslims taking to the street saying, this is not us. We stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Hamas does not represent us. The atrocities of October 7th are completely antithetical to who we are as a people. And we've built this over the last 100 years or 1,000 years. And now it didn't destroy anything. It actually revealed that what Jewish organizations have spent millions of dollars on and years putting effort into over the last, 80 years, and what governments have worked on and NGOs and activists. I mean, what did it lead to? Look at us on October 8th, exposed to the elements, to hatred. Look at Boulder, look at DC, look at Ottawa, look at Amsterdam. We're quite literally getting killed out there. Terrorism-related offenses in Canada are up, almost 500% over the last year. And there are many data points that haven't even been included in that. So I don't think that October 7th shattered any of these great relationships because there were no relationships. There was no allyship. I think maybe what it did is it revealed that to us. And now we can build from here, hopefully, maybe. But for those listening, particularly members of the Jewish community who have spent their lives going to other faith-based communities or academic institutions or what have you, and trying to say, hey, trust us. You can trust us. Believe us. We're one of you. We will build this hospital with you. We'll build this street or this park with you. Come to Israel. We'll show you. Jews have always in the West been trying to win favor and acceptance with non-Jews. And the people that we've spent decades doing that with have betrayed us. And so we need to get real about how far our efforts can really go when it comes to building allyship. We might want to take that effort and reinvest it into ourselves and into our own communities and making ourselves stronger. I'm not saying that we should completely abandon the ideas of allyship and community building and building bridges. No, those things are very important. But I think what October 7th has done has proven that there's probably some hard realities that we really need to face.
Hussein, I'll go to you and sort of on a similar theme, as the go forward, right? If we can try and be hopeful, if we can try and be optimistic. What are the chances for a day after in Gaza? Who are the leaders that could be useful? What signs are you looking at that you think, okay, maybe there's something?
I want, before I answer this question, comment very quickly on the previous question for Casey.
Absolutely.
One of the main, so this conflict runs on delusions, whether in the Middle East, whether here, it's one of the largest generator of political, social, religious, historical delusions in the world. Just exactly like the idea that it's a conflict between two people over a national home. It's actually just delusional. There's a much bigger structural index of world politics in it, a lot of conflicts. But the main delusion, or the mechanism through which this political delusion works, is the feeling of spontaneity. That is, you always think that things happen spontaneously. All of a sudden, all of these people are pro-Palestine. All of a sudden, all of these people are angry at Israel. As if it's spontaneous. Actually, none of this is spontaneous. This has been long time in the works. We at ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, we have uncovered billions of dollars of undocumented grants and donations coming from the Gulf countries, mainly actually one Gulf country, Qatar, that's been feeding a lot of American elite universities, buying chairs, buying endowment, pushing certain kinds of narratives and radical professoriate. A lot of Islamist-leaning networks have gained entry towards our institutions in the past decades because of this, along with, of course, the institutional capture that was happening from the radical left in general, along with a lot of the campaigns that are being orchestrated online. So none of this is spontaneous. This has been a planned. I mean, of course, there are a lot of spontaneous and accidental things, but no, there's been an infrastructure that was, by the way, way much larger, way more well-funded than any interfaith work or dialogue. It's just that the amount of countries that fund this, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, and others, it's just, we're talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about some of our most intelligent, most credentialed professoriates and thinkers and critical intellectuals who have been brainwashing a lot of young people with this. So I just want to remember this always, that actually nothing is going to change unless these structural factors are addressed. It's just simply we're digging in the ocean. As a saying goes, as long as we have the Qataris buying institutions, have the ability and the access to manipulate our media and educational environment like this, I don't think it will do much improvement. As about the future of Gaza, I'm not entirely certain if there is. I'm a pessimist by nature, so I'm not entirely certain if there's really a future of Gaza here that actually will move it forward as things currently are. What you actually need is again, which is related to the previous question, addressing structural factors, pressuring countries that have been pulling strings all along. The Qataris the countries that host Hamas leaderships, the countries that have been basically acting as the PR and propaganda networks for Hamas. Let's remember now the global networks of the international left and so on that have been also mobilizing support for Hamas. We know from internal documents from Hamas, we know from what they say, that actually what happens in Canada, what happens in the United States, what happens in Western Europe, factors in their decision-making. That is, when they see more people supporting them, they actually depend on that in their operations. Now, I don't see any of these issues stressed. I mean, that all of these countries coming together now and saying for President Trump, yes, we're ready, let's do peace. I don't buy much of it. I hope it happens. I want people to understand. I wish the ceasefire lasts forever, the hostages come back home, Gazans have a decent life. But I don't think any of these countries who have so much vested interest in keeping this conflict alive will actually work with the United States, work with Israel in order to end it, at least not in a way that keeps the interests of the United States or the interests of Israel, many of these countries have interests directly opposed to those of Israel.
Yeah, Einat, let's bring you in here for your thoughts on the day after and what's possible.
So again, the day after, I go back to my comparisons to Nazi Germany and Japan. The day after what? Because if there was a day after defeat, I would be much more optimistic. We now live, I joke that we live in a world of everyone gets a trophy. So we've become very we fear to talk about things like victory and defeat. And again, to what I said then with the EU, we forget that clear defeat, clear victory have been essential for peace. And the reason it's this, as in personal life, so in collective life, when there is understanding, a deep understanding that your life has come to nothing, that you've made a mess of your life, that your ideas have brought you to ruin, only then can you begin any kind of transformation. And right now, I don't yet see a drilling into the people of Gaza, and I would say Palestinians in general, the notion that given that their cause in the last more than a century has been to initially prevent and then undo the existence of a Jewish state in any borders, they lost. And over the years, I've come to realize that in foreign policy, everyone says they want to do good, they just want to feel good. The problem is that in order to do good, you actually have to do things that don't feel good. Like telling the Gazans and the people in the West Bank, you lost. You've wasted a century. You've wasted people's lives, resources. It's a tragic mess that you've devoted your lives, generation after generation, to the destructive goal of preventing the Jews from being sovereign in a sliver of their ancestral homeland. No one is willing to say things so clearly. If anyone has come close to it, it's President Trump. So in order to have an actual productive day after, which leads us in the direction of peace, because if I may say, Hamas right now is planning very well for the day after, the day that they take over both Gaza and the West Bank, the day that under some lie of a technocratic government, they are able to get billions in order to build themselves to undo Israel a few years down the line. They're preparing the day after. And I don't see anything on the other side that is preparing a day after in which this is not possible. And again, in order to do that, I don't care about disarming Hamas, because as long as their ideology is to destroy Israel, they will find arms. So I want the ideology to die so that they're not interested in arming themselves against Israel. And right now, I don't see clear, concrete languages that disarms the ideology. That's what has to be disarmed. I go back. No one in Gaza and the West Bank or in Jordan is a Palestine refugee. You do not have a right of return. You lost the war to prevent the Jewish state from coming into being. Enough is enough. You can live next to a Jewish state, but not in its ruins. Not a single dollar, euro, pound, yen will go into the Gaza Strip until we hear loud and clear that you have internalized that your destructive ideology is unacceptable. That's the only way we can build a day after. And right now, I'm not seeing anyone really trying to do that.
I'd be curious, Hussein, from your point of view, who has the authority to deliver that message? I mean, is it Trump? Who is the person, if we take Einat's point to its, conclusion?
Yeah.
Who owns that message then? Who needs to deliver it, and how does it get heard? And I mean that both almost metaphorically, and I also mean it literally, because of the information warfare that is happening in parallel, because of the disinformation on social media, because of the way this conflict is, as everybody has pointed out, is being manifested, is being adopted and embraced by activists and others there's a lot there again, but I'd be curious to hear who has to say that, and how does that message get heard?
I'm not entirely certain how we can. What Einat basically is talking about is a radical transformation of the ideological content of Palestinian identity itself. This is something that Einat's been talking about for a very long time. It's one of the things that we agree on. It's something I've been talking about a long time. But the problem is that this exact point, it's not feasible. It's not actionable, or at least not seen as actionable for a lot of people who are working for policy, strategists, diplomats, so on. They want something concrete, programs. Not to mention that a lot of people who work in foreign policy, whether in the government of Saudi Arabia or the government of the United States or government of Israel, have no idea what we're talking about. They basically don't just think about the world in this way. But nevertheless, I actually completely agree with you. Not that this radical transformation of Palestinian identity needs to happen. Ultimately, who can do this is actually Palestinians. It can't come from anyone else, but from Palestinians itself. That is, the Palestinian Authority have to internalize this message. It have to say it clearly to their people. But that's not what the Palestinian Authority says. If you go to the rhetoric of the Palestinian Authority that being pushed on the Palestinians, it's really just it's Hamas without Islam. That's basically the armed resistance, we will never give up armed struggle, even if it's hypocritically. Let's say that the Palestinian Authority are just really corrupt people. They would take money from America and Israel and do whatever they want, but that's not what they are telling. What they are telling their people. The Palestinians, I feel a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians. The Palestinians, like a normal Palestinian person, like any normal person, doesn't have opinions. Where do they get their opinions from? They get their opinion from the coffee shop, from the radio, from the TV, from their friends, from the school textbooks. So basically, you have cultural structures that provide the content of this identity that tells them this is what being a Palestinian means. Being a Palestinian means resistance, means being a martyr in the making, means having Palestine more precious than your children and your blood and your so on, and writing poetry and making it into movies and making it into plays. That sadly is the reality of a Palestinian culture. Now, this cultural production itself has to change. As I said, that's the Palestinian Authority. And now, very, very importantly, it's Al Jazeera. No one owns Palestine outside of the Palestinians. No one owns Palestine more than Al Jazeera. This is just a fact. I understand that the Qataris have a lot of fancy planes and billions of dollars that we like, but the fact is, Sheikh or Amir Tamim in Doha, he's the one actually holding the spigot on Palestine. He controls the largest media empire. Especially if we're talking regionally, forget about all of these Western leftist networks. Let's just talk about the region specifically, Arabic speakers. He's the one who owns Palestine. And he has absolutely been under no pressure to moderate this. Unless this changes, to be completely honest, I agree with you. There will not be a change, because you have generation after generation. Palestinians are humans. And when I say this, that means we defend them as humans, and we understand that what they believe about who they are fundamentally matters. I worked with a lot of Arab diplomats. I worked with a lot of American diplomats. I spoke to Israeli policymakers. They don't register this naturally. Again, they don't think in these terms. But the reality is, what these people believe about themselves matters. Now, what they believe about themselves is not it's not a mystical force that spontaneously arises in their being as Palestinians. No, they are told that by people on payrolls and salaries who work in institutions. UNRWA was, of course, and its schools is one of them. And what we need to do is actually go to these institutions and deal with them accordingly, for them to come up with a new story about what the Palestinians are, what they can be, what they indeed can be, in a way that is conducive to a better future for them and for the Israelis and for everyone.
We're going to move now to, we have about 15-ish minutes left, and I'd love to move to some questions from the audience. And there's a theme in some of these questions about the role of the Israeli government in all of this, and Netanyahu, the choices he's made, the way in which he has decided to prosecute this war militarily, strategically, politically. And I think we need to address that, right? We need to address and speak to the role of Netanyahu the Israeli government and their responses all along. And I don't know who wants to sort of take that first. I wonder about, the day after for them, for Netanyahu, and what this means for Israeli politics domestically. He wasn't in necessarily a good political place pre-October 7th, but what's your assessment, I guess, of how he's handled this? We know that there are allegations of war crimes. I don't want to get into the UN and the tribunals, and that's a lot to unpack in 10 minutes. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about Netanyahu, Israeli politics, and how this is carried out and what it's all meant and decisions he's made. Who wants to share some thoughts on that? Casey, I'll go to you because we'll bring you in here. You're muted.
I think we need to start with Einat. Just
sure, go ahead. Einat, you go first.
Look, one of the things that's difficult for me to do is to separate between Netanyahu as an excuse and Netanyahu as a politician taking decisions. If I go to him as a politician making decisions, my general comment within Israel is broad and utter incompetence. I think he failed to understand the enemy. Again, with all due respect to Iran and the different forces, ultimately the enemy at our doorstep has been, will be, remain until the radical transformation. Those who hold the ideology of Palestinianism. He totally didn't take them seriously. He still refuses to admit the extent to which Sinwar played him and played into the fact that he was underestimated, that Netanyahu underestimated the threat from Gaza. So the fact that the enemy was not correctly defined, it's not Hamas, the enemy is the ideology, the fact that he did not understand that the arena was not in Gaza. I would argue that the war in Gaza is less than 50% of the war that is taking place, and the war that is taking place is in people's minds on the screens. We were able to push back the invasion into Israel a few days after October 7th. We are yet to make a dent in the invasion into people's minds that has been taking place ever since, and it's truly dangerous. So most of my personal commentary is about his utter incompetence in the general management before and after. I separate that from him as an excuse. And it's very difficult because, as you can see, I would very much wish him to be away from power, because I think Israel could not afford, given its various challenges. It cannot afford incompetence. It cannot afford leaders who don't understand the nature of the conflict, who underestimate Palestinianism. We cannot afford that. But also, I understand that there's just this tendency to use him as a placeholder of everything that's wrong and everything that's evil. And if only there was not Netanyahu, there would be peace. Because look at the Arabs, look at Hamas, look at the Palestinians. They're just trying to make peace, and it's Netanyahu that is standing in the way. That is utter bollocks. I mean, really, structurally, Israel, even under Netanyahu, always said yes. Even now we said yes when Hamas basically didn't. And yet somehow Netanyahu is positioned as the one who said no, and Hamas is the one that's positioned as saying yes. Even on the hostages, people say, oh, he didn't agree to deals. What does it mean to agree to deals? Those were ransom demands for Israel to basically give up its security for its hostages. So there is Netanyahu as a leader, to which I have many, many criticisms, and there's Netanyahu as an excuse. And unfortunately, too many people are stuck on the excuse.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Well, Stephanie, I'll just jump in really quickly. I mean, I work at the INSS at Tel Aviv University. My bosses at the INSS, many of them are former and very senior intelligence officers, senior military officers. I listen to them. Netanyahu is not my prime minister, despite the fact that social media likes to think that I'm on his payroll. He's not my prime minister, and he's not the leader of the world's Jewish community. He does not speak for or act on behalf of the world's Jewish community. So I listen to people like Einat. I listen to people who live in Israel, who know Netanyahu, who know the environment much better than I do. But I will say this to sort of to what Einat was saying in terms of Netanyahu being an excuse rather than versus Netanyahu being a politician and making poor decisions. If I was Netanyahu, and I've asked this to other people, if I was Netanyahu and the equivalent of 50,000 Americans were murdered in my country, and my sons and daughters were raped and mutilated and kidnapped, and were being held by physicians and journalists, and in some cases, women, and in tunnels, and in schools, and in mosques, what would I do differently? You have to get the hostages out, and you have to defeat the enemy. And so Einat talked earlier about throughout history and warfare, there have been clear losers. The Nazis knew very clearly that they lost. They took an L, as the kids would say, okay? The Palestinians, Hamas, they started a war on October 7th, and they lost it. They're losing it. But that loss is being framed as not a loss, but a genocide. And so that's very intentional and very strategic. And so this is just a roundabout way of saying, Stephanie, that yes, Israel has some very serious, very significant days ahead of it politically. And in my opinion, Netanyahu should probably not be part of that future. But in terms of actually waging the war that in the way that he has waged it, I think it's naive of people to say, well, we wouldn't do that. Those horrendous photos, aerial photos and videos of Gaza that looks like that it's just in ash, we would have done things completely differently. I don't believe that that's actually accurate. And I also don't believe that Netanyahu and the Israeli government, for all their faults, and there are some really, really radical thinkers in the Israeli government who I have nothing in common with and don't really believe anything, share any of their views. I do not think Netanyahu wants to see bloodshed, wants to see Palestinian children and women die. No one wants to see these things. But what Netanyahu is a ruthless leader who understands concepts like deterrence, who, to a certain extent, who understands how wars are won and lost, and who understands that, as Einat said earlier, to achieve things, you're going to have to do things that are painful and very uncomfortable, and in this case, deadly. And so that's sort of my roundabout, my convoluted answer to that is that I guess I don't know if people would have done things much differently than Bibi.
Hussein, do you want to add anything?
Just very quickly, I want to say two things. Multiple things could be true at the same time. So there are a lot of rightful criticism that could be and should be directed at Netanyahu. In a way, you have October 7th happened after many, many years of Netanyahu leadership for Israel. It's impossible to look at this and not see Netanyahu as responsible in many ways for what had happened. Let's remember that a year before October 7th, Israel was embroiled in basically political instability. You had all of these demonstrations over the judicial overhaul. You had all of the officers. And by the way, in this part, I also blame Netanyahu's opposition for also creating these conditions. Ultimately, we know that Hamas leaders were thinking of these conditions when they decided took the decision of October 7th. So all of this is true. But at the same time, what Cassie said is true. This was not Netanyahu's war. So Netanyahu's war, even people use that term as if in order to walk a tight rope, we want to condemn Israel, but at the same time, we don't want to appear like monsters. So we call it, no, this was Israel's war. This war, Israel is a democracy. Actually has one of the most effectual, despite of October 7th, especially by regional standard, institutional and institutional climate and environment or state in the region. You have people, you have an entire class of security apparatus that manages security, and we've seen their successes. For example, the pager operations on Lebanon. I mean, you can say Netanyahu, but really this operation has been a long time in the making by a lot of various Israeli institutions. So this is, I agree with Casey. This was not Netanyahu's war. Netanyahu actually had a coalition for a good part of this war. All of the Israeli political figures, from Yair Lapid to Bennett to Gantz, supported launching this war against Hamas, because there was nothing else. Simply, you had no other choices. You need to get your people back, and you need to defeat Hamas. So people can blame Netanyahu and all the things that he deserves blame for. I agree with Casey. He should not have future. I'm not Israel. I'm not going to tell Israelis what to do. But in my humble opinion, I don't think after all of this is over, he should not have a future in Israeli politics. But by the end of the day, he's a convenient scapegoat for a lot of people or a lot of leaders who would like to find somebody to blame in order to appease their anti-Israel and anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist wings, while at the same time keeping Western commitments.
We need to sort of move to wrap this up, but I wonder, Hussein, if you could touch very quickly on one point, because you referenced it right there about the attack on Hezbollah and the pagers, and the extent to which those broader regional security dynamics have also changed in the last 2 years with Hezbollah in Syria, Iran, and I don't, as a sort of byproduct of Netanyahu and Hamas, what does that mean going forward in terms of the regional stability? And if we could keep that really tight, and then we'll ask everyone for some closing remarks before we say goodbye.
Well, this was probably the largest unintended consequence of October 7th. I mean, it was really the gift of Sinwar to the axis of resistance, which basically lays in ruins right now. The dismantling of the Hezbollah power base and leadership ultimately weakened the Assad regime, which meant that it ultimately fell very rapidly and surprisingly, to the shock of even Western intelligence agencies. Nobody expected this. And of course, nobody expected this because basically it was all a series of unexpected events. Now, Syria, once Syria is no longer part of the axis of resistance, Israel has been freed from really the Iranian strategy against Israel, which was basically to strangle Israel. This has been the strategy for decades. The Iranian vision was that Iran cannot really sustain a big war with Israel. So you basically strangle Israel around it with this axis of resistance, make it sink in chaos. And that threat will prevent the Israelis from attacking Iran and disrupting their nuclear weapon. That was the calculation. October 7th, it changed that. Ultimately, you saw the end of this trajectory is actually attacking the Iranian nuclear facility without Iran able to actually act or activate Hezbollah that doesn't exist anymore, or activate their agents in Syria. Now, the weakening or basically the destruction of the axis of resistance and the drastic weakening of Iran altered the regional dynamics irreversibly. And part of that alteration is not necessarily good for Israel, because by the end of the day, the Middle East is a very Hobbesian place. Everybody's selfish. Everybody's looking for themselves. It was Iran that brought, or the threat of Iran that brought Israel and the Arabs together to begin with. It's what pushed the Saudis towards Israel. Now that the Iranian threat is severely diminished, you saw immediately after the war, Arabs actually starting to rebalance their position to check Israel against Israel. By the end of the day, Arabs are their own actors. They want to be in better positions than the Iranians or the Turks or the Israelis. The idea is that
Hussein, I'm going to hold you there just so we don't run out of time. I'm going to go to you, Casey, just for a few concluding remarks, and then to you, Einat, then we'll come back around to you, Hussein, and then we'll say goodbye. Go ahead, Casey.
Thanks, Stephanie. I would just say just a couple quick thoughts. So much has been said today that is just very rich intellectually, thanks to Einat and Hussein. And we're talking geopolitics and we're talking diplomacy and security. But today is still October 7th. Make sure you're taking care of yourself if you're listening to this, and reach out to people around you who have been affected by this. We lost 8 Canadians who were murdered on October 7th. They have family members in Canada. They have friends in Canada. everywhere. Reach out to people who you think might appreciate it today, because today's one of those days. And also try to keep going. Don't fatigue sets in. It's been 2 years, but if you're paying attention to these issues, if you care about the things that we're talking about, don't stop, because as I said before, any void, any crack of daylight will be exploited by our adversaries at home and abroad. So keep going, and thank you so much for joining the call today.
Einat, to you.
I'll just reiterate the two fundamentals. What's going on in the world today has nothing to do with conflict, with resolution, with what's actually happening on the ground. It's the creation of a global mindset that believes that a good world, a better world, a kind of secular human rights salvation waits on the other side of getting rid of the collective Jew. It's a dangerous mindset that has never brought any society any good, and people should see it for what it is. All the libels that are being thrown at Israel, Zionism, are merely the mental preparation for the notion that therefore, by any means necessary, it is worth eradicating this evil so that we could bring forth utopia. And more specifically, I will say for this conflict, we need to pursue a long-term strategy, indeed, of the transformation, the radical transformation of the ideology, the identity that has been tragically organized around the destruction of the Jewish state into something constructive. I'll just insert this last word and vision that I have. I call it Arab Zionism. It might sound crazy. It might be, who knows, centuries ahead. But ultimately, the Jews are sovereign in their ancestral homeland. It means that they will forever remain a minority in an Arab and Islamic landscape, which means that true peace can only happen if more Arabs and Muslims begin to view the Arab and Muslim identity as one that is compatible with the embrace of Jewish sovereignty, rather than one that is obsessed with its undoing.
And Hussein, a final 30 seconds to you.
I want to actually go back to where Casey started when he talked about how for Israelis, the enemies are the borders, but now we have the enemies are inside here. And I think this is one of the most depressing developments after October 7th. The radicalization, the hate, a global movement that exploded, and that are recruiting not necessarily enemies, but a lot of innocent young people, destroying their brains. Just last summer, my friend Yaron Lachinsky and his fiancée Sarah Milgram were shot here in DC by a pro-Palestine radical left activist who came all the way from Chicago, brought his gun and came and shot them. We saw what happened in Manchester. We saw really what's been happening all over in terms of the increasing political violence, radicalism, and anti-Semitism. I think this is the most urgent thing for us, the people in the United States, people in Canada, people in Western Europe, to deal with. We now have true radical movements with true influence in our institutions and our media that are getting significant support from our undemocratic, anti-democratic, anti-liberal adversaries. And this is something that is here now, and we have to start dealing with it.
Thank you so much. And thanks to our panelists, thanks to our audience for being here. And I'll just close by saying, on this day, we remember those who were killed. We remember those who were still held hostage. We remember all of those whose lives have been forever changed by this conflict, no matter their nationality, their faith, their community, their geography. And may all of those memories push us to continued constructive dialogue. Let's keep asking the tough questions, and maybe one day we'll have peace. With that, I wish you all a very good day. Take good care.